I'm Charlotte Yvette. I am the New Zealand Government Relations Leader for Chartered Accountants Australia New Zealand. Thank you for watching our panel discussion, Counting the Cost of Coronavirus. Today I'm joined by 5 New Zealand business leaders who bring their unique perspectives on the social and economic cost of coronavirus to New Zealand. To my left, your panel is Liz Kendall, Senior Economist at ANZ Bank, Kirk Hope, Chief Executive of Business New Zealand, Rachel Maidment, Executive Director of the New Zealand-China Business Council, Dame Kerry Prendergast, Professional Director and Chair of the New Zealand Film Commission, Wellington Free Ambulance and the Royal New Zealand Ballet, amongst others, and Professor Siah Hwee Ang, who is the BNZ Chair in Business in Asia at the Victoria University of Wellington. Thank you all for joining me today to discuss this rapidly evolving situation. So with over 114,000 notified infections worldwide, more than 4,000 deaths, and in New Zealand we have more than 9,000 people in self-isolation, only 5 confirmed cases so far, luckily. Coronavirus will affect the health of New Zealanders and the economy. Hundreds of millions of dollars are likely to be shaved off the value of the economy in the first quarter and beyond, with agricultural exports, tourism and the international education sectors amongst the hardest hit. So the economic impacts of coronavirus are already significant and are changing by the day. In their press conference yesterday, the Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance both reiterated several times that we're dealing with a rapidly changing situation. Initially, predictions were for a lower growth in the first quarter. Now officials are predicting no growth in a challenging quarter, but yesterday the BNZ Chief Economist Stephen Topless predicted a probable recession. I'm really interested in the panel's take on how things are playing out, especially in the light of the 2,000-point fall in the Dow overnight and a 30% drop in the price of crude oil. That's all, we're in uncharted territory now, Liz. Can we start with you and then the rest of the panel can chip in as they see fit? What are your thoughts?
Absolutely. We're dealing with a rapidly evolving situation, but I think the one thing that we do know is that the impacts of this are not going to be good and they are not going to be brief. So initially we thought that a short-lived impact on GDP in the first half of this year was the probable outcome, but now we would say that a recession is looking actually quite likely and that a prolonged slowdown through this year could potentially be on the cards. We're facing a situation where exports are being dramatically hit at the moment, and I think this is really important to note, the widespread impact across other industries in New Zealand is going to be important too. So we're a very import-reliant country that affects industries across the board, and flow-on effects through to employment and households and business sentiment are going to be reasonably significant. The financial market stresses that we've seen starting to emerge with volatility quite high, liquidity quite low and credit spreads starting to widen are just a signal of the sort of seriousness of the risks that we're actually seeing unfold here. There's clearly a global slowdown happening and the impact on New Zealand is highly uncertain, but we would say these risks are serious and we're watching really, really closely and we're really worried.
Yeah, absolutely. And just what you mentioned about a rapidly evolving situation, the news, I'm looking back at the news a week ago and then looking at it today, I mean, it's just changed so much, like I mentioned, from a slowdown to a probable recession. Any thoughts from the rest of the panel in that area?
I think I expect the flow to actually come through for the rest of the year, because if you see that way, that normally services will get hit first, because basically that's the direct transactions that we normally see, right? So for example, tourism as well as education, but what we actually don't see is what will come through in the global supply chain, whereby we are talking about components, parts, you know, and all these other things that unfortunately we still have China producing most of them, which also means that they're not coming through, right? Just out of experience, you know, I was trying to order a MacBook and they say, look, you are not going to have this, either this old MacBook or you have another one from China, but that will be 3 months later, choose one or the other. So we are talking about, you know, the kind of a flow-on effect, not by the same industries, but probably multiple industries.
So for example, picking up on what you've just said, I understand China produces 80% of our smartphones and our notebooks, and those componentries, ordering them is going to be the delay you've talked about. And even if they recover within a few months, the rest of the world might not. So the downstream effects for all of us is going to be huge. And I understand China is already, managing to unload some containers and load them, but not enough to start sending componentry out. But although a lot of their big industries in the big cities are up and running, they're only at about a third capacity and not at the SME level.
And that's also not factoring in the businesses in New Zealand that rely on those components to actually make their product and get them out to market. So a lot of stress on business as well. But sort of heading back, so again to you, Liz, to begin with, I understand the next BNZ Reserve Bank New Zealand official catch rate announcement is due on the 25th of March.
That's right.
And predictions are that we're likely to go for the first time, am I correct, the first time in New Zealand's history below 1% if the rate is dropped?
That's right.
Yeah. And with talk now that I've never heard before in my lifetime about the cash rate going below zero into negative cash rates. My first question is that going to help? How much is that going to help? It seems they've got a very small amount to play with there.
Yeah, so I think what I would say is that monetary policy is just one part of the toolkit in response to what is a very unprecedented shock. And it's absolutely true that monetary policy can't lean against this or fix what's going on, but absolutely lower interest rates would help. We know that businesses are facing cash pressure, and having lower debt servicing costs would absolutely help. Even if it is at the margin, that's still really important. The same is true of households, but also I think there's a role for the Reserve Bank to play in actually reassuring markets and helping to lower the New Zealand dollar as well in the current environment. So we expect that they'll cut the OCR by 50 basis points in March with a follow-up cut of 25 basis points in May. But downside risks are increasing, so potentially we see the OCR going even lower than that, so that potentially puts the OCR in negative territory, or we start to see unconventional policy tools starting to be deployed. Now, there's a lot of uncertainty about the impacts and potential risks associated with this, but in terms of cost benefit, it absolutely, if we come to that, will be better for the RBNZ to deploy those tools and do what they can than to not. They have a role to play, so too does government and so too does banks, but it really is a really key part of that toolkit.
And how likely are they to pass any rate drop? How likely are the banks to pass that on to consumers?
So that's not a part of the bank that I work in, so I can't really comment on the sort of pricing and credit decisions that banks will be making. But what I would say is that absolutely a lower OCR will end up in putting downward pressure on interest rates relative to what would otherwise have been going on. But also banks have been pretty clear that they see themselves as having a role to play given the uncertain times and the stresses that businesses and households are facing in terms of helping get through this uncertain period. So I'm optimistic that banks will naturally play a role in helping weather this shock. Yeah.
I'm glad you're optimistic. Great. So you talk about cash flow on businesses, and that leads me into, I was watching the press conference with the Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance yesterday. And the Prime Minister spoke about expediting the measure whereby she has instructed government departments to pay your business within 10 working days. Actually, Kirk, your name was specifically mentioned in being instrumental in helping to push that through. So that's wonderful advocacy on behalf of business. I guess two parts to my question here. What else can the government do to help business? I know they have a range of other measures, but what can business do to help themselves?
Yeah, so two questions, what can government do? Well, I mean, it's interesting in terms of Liz's take on things about what the role of monetary policy. I mean, the Governor today said, he sees this as very much a secondary consideration, that the government have a lot of gas in the tank from a fiscal perspective. If the economic effects of COVID-19 go on for a long period of time, and they would be willing to that the government has already expressed its willingness to spend a lot to make sure the economy continues to operate effectively. I think what businesses can do for themselves. I mean, there is a second component to what the government can do in the immediate. In the immediate period of time, and that is, they can pay their suppliers very quickly, which is what they agreed to do. They can also do what we asked them to do as well, and that is provide wage subsidies for businesses to enable them to get through and retain employees within their business for the next period of time, and that might be maybe up to 2 months. So we were working with officials today on the detail of the support package, the wage subsidy support package. And it looks very much in its design detail like the type of wage subsidy that was provided to businesses in Canterbury and Kaikoura after those kind of big earthquake impacts. What can businesses do for themselves? They can talk to their bank early because that's really critical. If they feel like they're going to experience a liquidity issue, then they need to talk to their bank as early as possible so that they'll have the most options available to them, and the bank will have the most options available to them in the way that they respond to their clients. The Prime Minister has also suggested that the IRD would be in a position to for particular types of taxpayers or particular taxpayers delay, for example, provisional tax payments. But again, that'll require businesses to go and talk to the IRD early before they get into trouble. So I think there are a range of things that they can do from a practical financial perspective. I think at a health level, which is another set of circumstances. I think lots and lots of businesses of any scale or size are already testing their business continuity processes. Yes, we've only seen 5 cases of COVID-19 here, but 9,000 people in quarantine is a lot of people in quarantine, even if many of them are self-quarantined. So we aren't. We are isolated, but we're not immune to this disease. So I think businesses are having to prep themselves up from that perspective.
Absolutely, and I know at our organisation we've been told check your laptops, take them home, check that you're able to work from home. I guess not everybody has a reliable broadband connection, so I sort of think around how it could work if you had to work from home, and businesses are also planning for the worst case scenario too. So do any of the panel have anything?
Can I add that the redundancy issues can be just one of those kind of double-edged sword here, because we are talking about a situation that might go away soon. Well, sooner rather than later, right? That's what we are all hoping. But at the same time, the last thing we want is to take out the, sort of like get rid of people just because there's a crisis right in front of us. But at the same time, we run into the situation whereby New Zealand always have sort of not enough capacity to deal with excess demand, right, from out there. So we must maintain that kind of supply, so that in case the virus goes away sooner rather than to start another process of hiring people back again, which is another costly process anyway. So I'm with Kurt on this one around trying to ride out the whole issue within hopefully next 2-3 months.
On that point, I'd also note that I think this is one thing that often isn't so well understood in New Zealand. In China, there's a huge rate of digital penetration. So actually, this has provided the Chinese economy with some resilience that it wouldn't have had with regard to SARS, for example. So China has the highest rate of online payment methods in the world, and a very well-developed e-commerce infrastructure, and a fantastic ability for people to work from home, be educated from home, etc., which has built some resilience into that economy.
One of the areas, so I'm just talking about areas where it won't be easy to find more staff, and that's an area where I'm involved with rest home care. So we have a huge number of rest homes in New Zealand and hospitals, as Kirk talked about. But if you have a patient who gets COVID-19, and then you look at the kitchen and the laundry and the healthcare workers and the registered nurses and visiting medical staff and visitors who all might have to go into isolation. There just aren't enough healthcare workers or registered nurses out there to look after and care for the elderly in our rest homes. And so that is a major issue. The well, who can be self-isolate, is one thing. It's who looks after the unwell, both in our hospitals but our rest homes.
And given we only have as I highlighted before, only 5 identified cases of COVID-19 in New Zealand to date. I remember waking up and reading the headlines on Monday morning when it said our health workers were already stretched beyond what they felt they could withstand, and that's before any community outbreak. So that definitely is of concern. Absolutely. So when we talk about, obviously nobody knows how this is going to unfold, but what I have heard said a lot is that it's unlikely to be a devastating shock to the economy like the GFC was back in 2008, and that there were huge debt levels and it took years to recover from. It's predicted that perhaps it will be more like a normal recession, and when we come out of it, depending on how long that is, and obviously there are a lot of unknowns, that there will be a sort of a big recovery and rebound. So we go down and then we have a big up again, perhaps like after with the rebuild in Christchurch. Does anyone in the panel have a view on that?
I think that sort of strong rebound and hopefully manageable recession is what we would expect to see. But I think we always need to be vigilant to the possible risks that do exist within financial systems. So certainly we don't expect any sort of GFC-like event, but because there are high debt levels, and particularly, say, in US corporate debt markets, debt levels are very high and credit spreads are starting to widen a little bit. That's why central banks, I think, need to be really willing to act quite quickly to shore up liquidity in the financial system, just to ensure that we are working to protect against the sort of risks that can emerge when financial markets get really jittery.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've got to be careful about making a longer term assessment about something which which has traditionally had a lot of volatility in it. And financial markets get volatile when they face uncertainty, and they're facing a fairly significant patch of uncertainty here. But there's no doubt that the type of recession that we saw, well, in New Zealand it was a very short-lived recession, but the type of thing that we saw with the GFC is not anticipated here. It's not anticipated unless there is a really long tail to the health impacts of COVID virus. The economic impacts are not anticipated as being as long. So you would expect to see a pretty big uptick. And, to the point made before about our ability to respond to that demand when it rebounds, that's one of the key reasons why the government's announcement yesterday about keeping people employed was really important and significant, because we need to be able to respond to that demand. A lot of that is, we call it export demand, but it's in New Zealand services which we're providing to out of New Zealand customers when they come and travel here. So we need to be able to respond to that.
Can I add that I see this as a very different scenario compared to the GFC, because the GFC, you can argue that, certain countries have better financial mechanisms in place, so they play a lot more around those paper money and so on and so forth. So other sort of down-to-earth countries are actually less affected. But then in a crisis like this that we are facing at this point, is actually the global, right? It's actually a sort of a global enemy of some kind. So basically, if some countries are in recession, so is everyone else. So I see us like picking up when tourism and education starts to pick up, other things will start to pick up at the same time. So it's not the situation whereby we run into like, will New Zealand be in a recession and other countries don't? They will be, right? If we are there, they will be the same.
In terms of, so we've talked about a lot about the economic impact, and obviously it's very important, and it has an impact on all of us in many different ways. Kirk, you talked about the health impact before and what we can do, but there's another facet of this, and this is the social impact, which I'm also really keen to explore. And especially in terms of, I think we saw some, some behaviour that we didn't like to see when this sort of hit the headlines. It was initially just China. It spread further abroad. Now it's in Italy and all over the world. But Rachel, can you speak to the social impact coronavirus has had on Chinese New Zealanders and some of the behaviours that we've observed?
Well, certainly within the Chinese community that we deal with on a regular basis, I've found the Chinese community to be taking this extremely seriously. They've taken a really prudent and responsible approach to the quarantine measures that have been put in place. And to date, we obviously haven't had any transmissions, direct transmissions from China, which is really quite astounding considering the depth of the people-to-people links that we have with China. So yes, I think the Chinese community has taken a really responsible and active approach.
And in terms of some of the xenophobic behaviour, I mean, obviously that would be hurtful and unpleasant.
I think the xenophobic behaviour, we see this on a regular basis, and we have to be really, we have to ensure that we stamp it out and call it out where we see it. It's really important to attack the virus, not the people. And during this period, we really need to be supportive of each other and our Chinese communities.
Yeah, absolutely supportive of each other. And I think this leads me to panic. Kirk, you talked about the markets before and how they reacted to sentiment, and the markets were actually doing really well for a while, and then all of a sudden Italy went into lockdown and people panicked and the markets tanked. We've seen instances of toilet paper and fights in supermarkets, and I think they make toilet paper in Australia, but anyway. So I guess the message is stay calm and be kind to each other. Do you agree? And do you have anything further to add, any of you?
Well, I think my observation would be remain calm. There's no need to panic yet. I mean, the government has now expressed from an economic perspective its willingness to support the economy in need, and it has the capacity to be able to do so. We may need to think about how we manage the health consequences if it became significant or embedded here. But again, that is a process that we can go through without a sense of panic, but a sense of focus, I think. And the types of images that you see when you see people queuing in supermarkets. I actually said to someone the other day about that, the Herald article, there was a beer special on in that pack and save that night. I think you just have to be a bit careful about some of that imagery. I would hope that our media reports on some of the key issues, but is also imbued with ensuring that there is a general sense of an acknowledgement that this can be managed, and it doesn't need to have people don't need to panic.
I think the Prime Minister has been an amazing communicator at coming out and reminding everybody there's no need to panic. We're a primary producer, there's heaps of food, but to hear that, so for my daughter, example, lives in Kandala, you can't buy Panadol at the local supermarket. Right. So people are starting to stockpile certain medications, and what that will mean is that there's only a certain amount in the country. We don't need to do that, and the message is, I think the Prime Minister's been very good at trying to get the message out, and hopefully the media continue to reinforce, please don't do anything about stockpiling or panic buying.
Yeah, the other thing that has to watch that space is about the stability of prices. So I've just heard from someone that one of the places in Lambton Quay is selling at $5 per mask. They're one of the few people who has masks, so they're selling you at about $249 for 50 masks per pack.
It's called the
market. So, yep, that's called the market demand. So creates that supply, but I guess they hide the supply, I assume so. So I think, there needs to be a stability of prices, because otherwise it will, some profiteering will start to emerge, and then there's going to be chaos everywhere.
Well, yeah, I guess that's what panic brings about, unless the rational consumer says, actually, I'm not going to pay $250 for a small number of masks. So I think I agree, Kerry, that our Prime Minister has been a great in terms of communicating a calm response. I was impressed to see yesterday that the heads of the big four banks had met with the Minister of Finance, and they had agreed some measures in terms of enabling principal-only payments for businesses in need, potentially some working capital as well, and a couple of other measures. Liz, that's really positive to see that the banks are stepping up.
Yeah, sort of like I mentioned earlier, I think banks see that they absolutely have a role to play, because with businesses having to weather these uncertain times, but knowing that things will get better on the other side, there's really a role for banks to play in terms of providing credit and ensuring that businesses that would otherwise be viable can really get through this. I suppose one thing I would say just in terms of the response is that I think that there's a delicate balance in terms of not wanting to instill panic, but I think there does need to be a healthy degree of caution out there, actually. I think businesses do need to be thinking quite carefully about how they manage the risks that they are facing at the moment in terms of cash flow, in terms of talking to their bank, as has already been mentioned. And while I think the government has been taking some really good steps in terms of doing some measures, particularly to industries that are very directly affected at the moment, which are really, really quite encouraging. I think the wage subsidies was a great step. I do also think, though, that in time we're really going to need actually a much broader response that affects all industries, because what we're seeing is that no sector is going to be immune if this becomes a synchronised slowdown, as it looks like it might actually be over the next year. So I think the government has heaps of firepower to do more, and they've indicated a willingness to do that, which is absolutely fantastic. But I just think in time we're going to need to see some much broader sweeping measures come in.
Yeah, I mean, I probably agree with that. But I think what they've done is responded, you know, in a timely fashion to some of the more immediate impacts. I mean, you know, Kerry, you'll know better than I, but tourism, international education, hospitality, restaurants, some of those tourism-related industries which are relying on foot traffic, actually, or industries which are relying on foot traffic, they're relying on arrivals. And those arrivals, even so, yes, you know, we've had the travel ban with China, so we're not taking Chinese visitors. But even other economies which are traditionally strong tourist markets for us, where there's no bans, you know, we've seen a lot of visitor arrivals drop off. Yep. So those peripheral industries are really immediately impacted. Now, they can be supported in a very targeted way, but I agree, Liz, if it goes on for any longer, for a long period of time, then you're going to need more sort of general fiscal stimulus that might come in the form of tax cuts, or, you know, because it needs to be immediate to put liquidity back into the economy.
But it's not the obvious things in the tourism sector that everyone thinks of, like the hire cars and the accommodation. It flows all through the cafes, the bars,
Absolutely.
The dairies, where you buy your petrol if you've got a hire car. And what we've seen, as you've said, Kirk, is a drop-off not just in Chinese visitors, which is significant, but in many other countries as well. And so the year-on-year growth's dropped to 2.4, and it's been significantly higher than that. And this last month, it's actually been minus 3%. So we've seen a significant drop-off in international visitors. And the government was very good in the initial days at talking about a package to stimulate both in the winter and in the shoulder season, people initially from Australia, and in the shoulder from the UK and North America, to put more campaigns into those markets. And they've also put aside some money when this is starting to recover to go back into China to encourage Chinese visitors to relook at New Zealand as a place to visit.
I think that's a really important point, because there's often a misconception that Chinese travellers are lower value package tour groups, but actually that's changed a huge amount over the last few years, and now there are higher spending groups, a category, a huge number of free and independent travellers that are travelling all over the country.
They're our most valuable visitor, so people don't realise that they're much more valuable than a visitor from North America or the UK or Germany. So they were very valuable to our economy, and in fact, it's with the travel ban, it's a $1.7 billion hit to our economy annually with no Chinese visitors.
Wow.
And talking to, if you listen to TIA tourism industry, Aotearoa, they believe this is going to be $1 billion hit overall just from a tourism perspective, flowing through all the different parts of the economy it hits. And you've only got to go to Queenstown or Rotorua now, so tourism hotspots, and already see how quiet they are.
And I think you're all right in pointing out you're all correct in pointing out that it's not just the loss in Chinese tourists. When you think through your individual workplaces, many workplaces have put on a non-essential travel ban, and many people also, in the spirit of wanting to stay safe, are reluctant to travel as well. So, with that change in behaviour, that has flow-on effects. So other countries will be doing that in terms of travelling to New Zealand as well. People are thinking twice about taking the holidays that they had perhaps booked. So it has a shrinkage across the whole economy in terms of tourism.
As we heard from the new Chief Executive of Air New Zealand yesterday, when he detailed what the impact is on the various routes. So he said, I chair the Film Commission. We had staff going to LA to activate around the premiere of Mulan. When we looked at the impact at travel insurance and what the impact would be, because our staff wouldn't be covered, we decided not to send the staff. So that's an example of what you just said.
I mean, to back up Kerry's point, I mean, about 6 weeks ago, we went out to a group of businesses around the country and said, tell us the impacts that you're seeing in Otago, Southland, and in particular in Queenstown. We got a lot of feedback in terms of the percentage drop that they were seeing in foot traffic and demand. This was 6 weeks ago, and it was about 30%. And I sort of said, I'm not sure that's right. There must be something else going on. But that really triangulated with arrival numbers as well. So when we shared that with the government, they said, oh God, that looks roughly like what's happening with our arrival numbers. So we've already had some industries in New Zealand that have been going through this for 6 weeks, and it's a very strong drop in demand. It's a significant demand shock for a number of sectors that I'm not sure that people really fully understand yet.
The tourism industry is made up mainly of small business people, and they just can't cope. They make their money in our summer season, the main, and Tourism New Zealand does everything it can to encourage people to come on the shoulders, and of course into Queenstown for winter. But this is what makes the whole year sustainable this time of year, so they're really taking a hit now.
And another industry that has been very vocal about the hit that they have taken is the tertiary education industry. With Grant Guilford, who's the Vice-Chancellor of Victoria University of Wellington, has been in the news saying that Auckland University stands to lose $35 million. I think that's the first term alone. I think Victoria University was around $12 million, with the hit to New Zealand universities being up to $300 million. I was speaking with our Vice President, who is a professor at Massey University. It sounds like they are set up slightly differently in that they have already got their online offerings. That was sort of a core part of the way that they operate. So acknowledging the significant economic impacts to the university sector, does this also present us and with an opportunity to perhaps sharpen up our strategy in terms of our e-learning offerings for the future, which is what many students demand anyway?
Yep, definitely. I think, with every threat comes with every opportunity, right? So we always have to look at the flip side of things. But I think the university system always prides itself as, face-to-face, right? So I mean, and it's quite normal. Say, for example, if you are trying to do a online study with MBAs, right, Master of Business Administration, most of them just want to see the humans. Mm-hmm. They don't really want to talk to the computer. And so if you actually send them through a computer and charge them $40,000, they will be like, hey, wait a minute, what is this, right? So it's always that model that, sort of the human-to-human interaction that prides very sort of high-end offering of the universities. But in the last few years, what we have experienced, or even the last decade, we do have a lot of international offerings around the world whereby people start to do distance learning. So it might be a model of the way forward, right? In many ways, I mean, a lot of documentation can be done, through PowerPoints, give them material beforehand, and then I speak to the video like today, and basically record it down, and then, sort of point to point, except the human interaction part, which I think these days we can do it through Zoom and so on. So I think it's a good disruption in many ways. I think I must say that a lot of academics are not used to this disruption. So I think that the university system feels like it's a bit under stress. but also the revenue of it, because international students does pay about 4 or 5 times that of domestic students. So when we have the ban on the 2nd of February, then it becomes like a nightmare overnight, right? It was a Sunday, I think. So by Monday, everyone is coming back and say, okay, the world has changed, right? It's time to respond, but also at the same time start counting the cost of the virus itself. It's quite challenging, and the numbers that you see on the newspaper can be just an estimation of the first trimester, which is from now until June. What might happen next is that if you actually lose those students in March to June, and where they are new students, they might actually not come back for the rest of the year or for the rest of their life.
Yeah, or at all.
Yeah, so we lose them permanently rather than, and actually if they are undergrad students, you lose them for 3 years of our future revenue. And I must say that if you look at the universities as well, there's also significant hit on the local economy because of the fact that the Chinese, the biggest employers, and as well as they pay, the international students pay heaps for our rental and all these things. So it does hit all the local community in terms of the, whatever GDP or whatever you calculate, right, in the local way. So I would normally put that as if Victoria says that it's going to get hit with 12 million, I suspect another 12 million will go to the Wellington city as a result of that mix, 1-to-1 roughly.
And of course it was after they'd set their budgets, so it's not something you can easily recover, and most of the universities have put a cap on any more employing any more staff.
Precisely.
It's highly competitive in terms of, within China trying to get those international students. And a lot of countries are spending a lot of money to, market themselves offshore. And also within China, it's actually becoming more competitive in terms of the tertiary institutions increasing their international rankings is also attracting a lot of students too. So it's a tough business.
So nobody knows what's going to happen in terms of COVID-19. Like thus far in New Zealand, in its very early days, it's stayed quite contained. Assuming we don't have a massive community outbreak, and based on the knowledge that you have at the moment, when could we forecast a pickup? How soon after the Chinese visitors return to New Zealand, travel bans are lifted? How soon would we expect to see a recovery? Start with you, Liz, since you're...
It's because you're closest. Okay,
we'll hold you to this question.
Yeah, that's a really hard question because obviously doctors and virologists who are tracking the virus don't know what is going to happen. So if any economist tells you that they know what's going to happen in terms of the timing, they're just lying through their teeth. But what I would say is that this will take a while for us to really work through. I think regardless of the way the outbreak trajectory goes, I think there are scars that will take some time to heal in terms of people's willingness to go out and travel, their willingness to spend in the way that previously they had, and for businesses to really ramp up, and for supply chains to normalise. So I guess I would say that once we get to a point where, and we really hope that this happens soon, that the outbreak tapers off. From there's still going to be some time that it takes in order for things to really normalise. And then potentially we're looking at a really quite large rebound, which is always worth bearing in mind that we still see those long-term prospects for the New Zealand economy as being really positive. So we don't know how long it's going to take, but we hope that we'll get there soon.
In terms of a long-term rebound, I guess we go back to Kirk highlighted before that the government had come through with the wage subsidy package, which the details are being fleshed out currently, and that it was likely to look somewhat like the Kaikoura Christchurch package, whereby businesses received a certain amount of money per full-time employee and per part-time employee to enable them to stay employed while they rode out the tough times. Also, we hear a lot about a shortage of skilled workers in New Zealand as well. So I guess marrying those two things together for businesses to be able to retain their staff so that when the rebound does kick in, and we're hoping that sooner rather than later, that's a really positive thing.
Yeah, the other point that I make in terms of the, how this might happen or how it might play out. China is gearing up again, so people have been told to go back to work. One benefit that New Zealand has is that it's primarily a food exporter, and those channels are open back up into China. So that's a positive thing. The challenge is, there's a lot of refrigerated containers sitting still in China, so getting the product there is going to take a bit of time. Nevertheless, it's been prioritised. So our exports are being prioritised back into China. That's good because in February, year on year, we had a 50% decline in our chilled beef. So that's a pretty big impact if it goes on too long. So good news that that China's starting to open back up for business, and that'll be good for the types of things that we were talking about before in terms of components and supply chains, but it'll take a bit of time. But the challenge will be if there's a secondary infection rate that goes through China, that will just shut things down again. So, in terms of how long this might go for or how it might go, it might be really stop-start in terms of, as these things play out in different economies. So we just got to be prepared that we can, or the government and businesses they're going to face potentially some pretty big swings and roundabouts during the course of this year. Just be I think, prepare for that, plan for it, make sure you've got plenty of capital and liquidity available, because there will be rebound in demands, but in demand, I should say, at certain points, but if it peels off again, you just get through the next bottom out. So I think it's worthwhile keeping that in mind.
I think
I was going to say that these things in the past tend to get weaker, the viruses, as they go on. So they start off really strong, but they get weaker. But you're right about secondary infection back into China. So they may have recovered, and then they may start putting travel bans on people entering back into their countries. The other thing for New Zealanders is when they've taken a hit at the share market and their savings, how long before they feel confident enough to start spending money, not only locally but going offshore on holidays, because planes work, they not only have to be full coming, they have to be full going as well.
Yeah, my view is that the day that tourism picks up again, it will be the day that we actually start to feel that people are getting used to the flu virus, because I've read a lot of scientific, talk about this virus, but it's just one of the other viruses anyway. So we panic a lot more. Don't panic about other viruses, but we panic about this one. But I think if it leaves among the other viruses that we will encounter, so like the jab that we are meant to have in the next 2 months, we are going to have another one of those jabs, right?
Yeah.
So once we get used to it, people start to travel and all these other things. And I think that's where we get used to another virus living among us. So.
The trouble is the jab you're about to have, they have the vaccine for. They don't have the one for at least another 2 or 3 years for COVID-19.
Yeah.
So the government, there's meant to be an increase to the minimum wage to $18.90 an hour, I think, from 1 April this year. So that's about a 7.3% increase. Given the issues for business with cash flow, then do the government need to put the brakes on this wage increase?
Well, I mean, I think the hospitality sector have already called for a halt or a temporary postponement while this plays out. The government could easily do that, and it doesn't cost them any money, but it enables those businesses to retain a bit more liquidity. That said, if they're putting the money into their employees' pockets and they're spending it, again, that's cash flow that's running into other businesses and through the economy. So I think you have to be, and politically, so let's move away from the business side. Politically, it's going to be tough for a Labour-led coalition really to cancel or postpone minimum wage increases. It will put them under a lot of pressure, I would have thought.
I think it's tough, but it's the right thing to do.
Yeah.
The minimum wage increase was always said to be conditional on economic conditions, and I think we're at a point where those economic conditions would say, actually don't do it. In terms of the social impact, the potential impact on jobs, if businesses come under more pressure, is more worrying than the sort of wage increases that people might be potentially losing. So, in terms of the economics, it looks like an obvious thing for us in terms of policy that could be just delayed rather than necessarily cancelled. But clearly, the political will to do that would be difficult.
Flows through to local government. A lot of them jumped on the wagon with the living wage, which comes from ratepayers. And if ratepayers are hurting because the economy's hurting, and yet they're supporting the living wage, which is higher than the minimum wage. So maybe there needs to be some political courage at local government level as well.
Yes, well, it's an election year. So, so we will see. So I guess just sort of wrapping up now, Kirk, you spoke before, and while we're on the topic of government and what they can do to help, so they have they've suspended the stand-down period for MSD for people like I've read about some forestry workers on the East Coast who will be too late for the wage subsidy. They've lost their jobs. There've been a lot of people laid off there, so that's something that could perhaps slightly help families who are in difficult positions there. So there's the wage subsidy, the potential to defer provisional tax payments, and with the IR, the different offers that banks are putting forward in terms of working capital and the rest. Kirk, you mentioned tax cuts. What are some other measures, policy measures that the government could use to ease the burden on business and individuals if the need arises?
Well, I mean, I think we sort of just, when we covered it earlier, I think it's kind of in two parts. It's fiscal versus monetary policy, or not versus, fiscal and monetary policy. So, you know, if the Reserve Bank say, okay, we're going to cut, 50 basis points or go to zero because we really want to stimulate, we want more cash in the economy. There are other tools that they can use, which they announced today, where they can put more cash into the economy. But again, you know, that's kind of probably secondary to the volume of liquidity that central government can really put into the economy. So what else could they do? You know, tax cuts is an immediate thing. They can increase benefit payments. That's another immediate thing, particularly for people who have recently lost their jobs, because, you know, going from a wage to a benefit is a big cut. So there are some practical things, but it will cost a lot of money. I think BNZ. They assessed that it was, you know, the government would need to put about 60 billion into the economy to support businesses and communities during kind of what this downturn might look like. I'm not sure about that assessment, but that gives you a sense of the scale of things that they might need to do. One of the other things that they could do is they've already announced a package of about $12 billion worth of transport measures. They could bring those forward using some of the types of legislation that they used in Canterbury, where they just say, okay, look, in normal times we'd run through a whole series of planning rules. Actually, we're just going to do this stuff because we need to employ people and they need to be employed. And by the way, we need the infrastructure. Again, you know, there's risks with that, but it's an opportunity as well. So those are some of the types of, you know, short, medium, and longer term things they could do.
And perhaps does this give rise to them being able to relax their sort of stated 15 to 25% borrowing range?
I think that should be thrown out immediately. I think 60 billion you said would see that ratio rise potentially quite substantially, but that is absolutely within the range of normal sort of responses to these sort of events. So New Zealand is in a great fiscal position at the moment because of those debt targets and the sort of prudent approach of successive governments, but now is the time to really increase those debt ratios. And
the opposition has agreed agreed that they were there except for extraordinary times, and I think we're at such a time.
Yes,
so.
yes.
Yeah, those debt levels are really for, you know, normal business as usual.
BAU.
This is not BAU. Yeah.
No, it most certainly isn't. And I guess just one final comment or question before we wrap up is in terms of the positives. So we spoke about the tertiary sector maybe being able to future-proof themselves a bit more with the use of, you know, tools such as Zoom and getting online, but also this is, you know, it has a negative effect on the economy and therefore on people's lives. It brings with it a lot of stress, but that aside, if we can, for a moment, is this going to help us in terms of our response to risk going forward, to our economy to be more prepared, to consider diversification? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I think one thing that I'd say is that from a markets perspective, I mean, from an export markets perspective, I think you'd already seen lots of exporters look more broadly than China. China is still an incredibly important market, as is Australia, as is the US, and we don't have an FTA with the US. But around CPTPP, in particular, Japan had been, our two-way trade with Japan had been expanding quite rapidly. So one thing that I'd say is the more diversified we can be in terms of the better access that our exporters can have to a broader range of markets, the better insulated we're going to be, because we'll always have alternatives. We won't have all our eggs in one basket, and businesses will be, there'll be incentives for them to move into those markets because they're not going to be tariffed, or the tariffs will be reduced and so forth.
And Tourism New Zealand's been doing that for a long time, and we talked about earlier that visitor from China is our most valuable visitor, and it would be easy to say, well, let's put all of our money into China. But as a board, with management support, we made the decision you didn't want all the eggs, because something, not that we anticipated this sort of shock, but any sort of shock could mean that one country or two or three. So we have always invested across a range of markets, and I think that was a very wise and will continue to be our policy for Tourism New Zealand.
I think New Zealand has done well in terms of diversifying, with like at least Australia and China as the main two. But then I think this is just more about China's evolution in the world, right? About them playing a very big part of everything themselves rather than us relying on them or not, right? So for example, those things that they are making in the middle of the global value chain, right, actually affects everyone else. But one can speak like, maybe we should get more involved in global value chains of the future, right? So that we control a bit of the front end and the back end, so that we are just not reliant on everyone else, by giving them the raw materials, and hopefully something will, come out of it, or whichever way that is.
Yeah.
And we certainly need diversification, but the reality is China is the biggest trading partner for more than 120 countries.
And we are tiny.
That's right. So it's always going to remain incredibly important. But actually within China, I think there will be some opportunities that come out of this as well. So, for example, our natural product sector has been growing extremely rapidly since 2014 and is now worth 750 million. So that can expect a boost. And also a lot of traditionally Chinese people, a lot of people turn to protein in terms of supporting an immune response. So we've heard anecdotal stories of, for example, taxi drivers being given small bottles of milk. So I would imagine, like Kirk said earlier, there will be industries such as food staples, etc., and natural products that will benefit.
And our milk powder, infant powders already. The sales have been huge over the last few months.
Yeah, dairy is one industry that hasn't taken a hit. Yeah.
Great. Right. Well, I've come to the end of my questions for you, and you've been a wonderful panel. Thank you. Do any of you have anything further to add before we wrap up for the evening? Well, I want to thank all five of you very much for giving of your time and expertise here today. This has been very interesting and informative. So thank you very much, and thank you, audience, for watching.
Thank you.